I've been married to Jessica for almost 12 years. If you'd asked me 6 months ago, I'd have told you without a doubt that ours was a happy marriage. We have 2 kids, a nice home, and I run a small but successful business. I work long hours, not because I want to, but because I know what it takes to keep this life going. The house, the vacations, the little luxuries she likes. Jessica's a realtor. She always had this polished, confident charm, and I admired how she seemed to light up any room she walked into. It made me proud, honestly, to see her out there doing her thing, being that person everyone else looked up to. I thought she was happy, that we were happy. Looking back, I guess I didn't see the cracks forming because I didn't want to see them. But then one night, everything started to unravel. It happened by chance. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter while I was cleaning up after dinner. I wasn't snooping. I've never been the type to doubt her. If she wanted space, I gave it. But a message popped up, and I don't know, something about it just seemed off. The sender's name was Matt, and the message read, "Can't stop thinking about you." Tonight was incredible. For a second, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe a work thing, something that got twisted in translation. But as I scrolled, I found more messages, all from Matt. There were photos too, some of her, one she definitely didn't take from me, dressed in a way that, well, let's just say it was nothing like the wife I thought I knew. I felt sick. My hands were shaking, and I had to sit down. I knew if I asked her about it, she'd brush it off. Jessica had this way of deflecting whenever something didn't go her way. So I decided not to confront her, not yet. Instead, I followed her. The next day, Jessica told me she had a late showing. Her usual line. I watched her drive off and gave her a few minutes before I got in my car. My heart was pounding the whole time, but I just kept telling myself I had to know the truth. She pulled into the driveway of a property she'd supposedly been showing, only she wasn't alone. Sarah's husband, Dave, was already there waiting. I parked down the street and watched as they walked into the house, hands entwined, laughing like a pair of teenagers. This was no fling. This was something deeper, something that had been going on right under my nose. It was then that I realized the life I'd been living was a lie, and that Jessica, my wife, the woman I'd loved for over a decade, had been lying to me every single day. I sat there in my car, paralyzed, watching as Jessica disappeared inside with him. I can't even explain the kind of numbness that washed over me. I didn't cry, didn't scream, just sat there, gripping the wheel, my mind blank, like my brain was refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. A few minutes passed, maybe more. I can't even tell you. When I finally drove home, I kept picturing the little things that used to mean so much to me. Her smile, the way she'd lean her head on my shoulder after a long day, how she'd brush her fingers through my hair as we watched TV after the kids were asleep. I thought it was love. It probably was, but somewhere along the way, something had broken in her. When she got home that night, Jessica was all smiles, saying she'd closed the sale and talking about how excited the clients were. I played along, nodding, trying to keep the bile rising in my throat at bay. She had this easy way about her, like there was nothing unusual about her day. I realized, with a strange kind of horror, that she'd probably come home to me this way dozens of times before. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured them together. My head spun with questions. How long had this been going on? Why him? Was it about the thrill, or had she fallen for him? I kept replaying everything in my mind, analyzing each little detail, each distant look, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. But the thing that kept gnawing at me was the fact that it wasn't just any random man she'd chosen. It was Dave, Sarah's husband. Sarah, who was her best friend. They'd been close for years. Our kids even played together. I wondered if Sarah knew. God, it was all too twisted, like some nightmare soap opera come to life. By morning, I knew I needed to talk to someone who might understand this insanity. So I called Sarah. I had to know if she was as in the dark as I'd been, or if she knew something, anything, that could explain what was happening to our lives. When she picked up, I could tell she was still groggy, maybe not expecting to hear from me at 6:30 in the morning. I told her I needed to talk. Sarah's voice had that half-asleep, half-concerned tone when she answered, like she knew something was wrong but hadn't yet processed what it could be. I couldn't say the words over the phone, so I asked if I could come over. She sounded confused but agreed, and 15 minutes later, I was standing at her door. She opened it, and I could tell she was trying to read my face, searching for clues. I don't know what she saw in my expression, but her own face started to tense with worry. I walked in, sat down, and took a deep breath, trying to find a way to say what I had to say. "Sarah, I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to rip off the Band-Aid." I started, my voice shaking. "Jessica, I think she's having an affair. With Dave." Her face went blank. For a moment, she just stared at me, like she didn't understand the words coming out of my mouth. Then, slowly, the color drained from her cheeks. She shook her head, almost as if she was trying to shake off what I'd just told her. "What are you talking about?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I took a deep breath and explained everything I'd seen the night before. The late showing, the house, the way she and Dave walked in together, hand in hand. I watched Sarah's face change as I spoke, from disbelief to hurt to anger. It was like she was cycling through every emotion in real time, her eyes widening and tearing up all at once. When I finished, she didn't say anything. She just sat there, breathing heavily, staring into space like she was somewhere else entirely. Then, she covered her mouth with her hand, and I could see her eyes welling up. "I've had suspicions," she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "He's been distant, secretive, but I never thought." Her voice trailed off as she blinked back tears. "How could they do this to us?" I didn't have an answer. All I could do was sit there, feeling just as lost and betrayed as she did. After a few moments, Sarah cleared her throat, her voice steadying. "We need to do something," she said, her face hardening with determination. "We can't let them get away with this. If they think they're just going to go behind our backs and destroy our lives, they've got another thing coming." Her resolve gave me a strange sense of relief. At least I wasn't in this alone. Sitting there with Sarah, I felt a strange sense of camaraderie. She wasn't crumbling, and that helped me keep myself together. We weren't just betrayed spouses anymore. We were allies, bound by this horrible truth. "I can't just sit back and let them keep lying to us," she said, wiping away a stray tear, her jaw set in determination. "We need to confront them, but not yet. If they can play games, so can we." We sat in silence, each lost in thought, letting the idea settle. It was Sarah who broke the silence. "Tom," she said, her voice firmer now, "I think we need to turn the tables on them." "What are you thinking?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "We should make them feel what it's like to be left in the dark, to be suspicious, to feel like something's wrong but not know what," she replied, her eyes flashing with a determination that I hadn't seen before. "Let's get them to question each other, make them wonder if we know, but keep them guessing. Let's make this hurt for them." Her words lit a spark in me. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back some control in this mess, about not being the fool any longer. I nodded, feeling more alive than I had in days. "So, what's the plan?" She took a deep breath, thinking, "Let's start small. They need to know we're on to them, but we won't give them the satisfaction of knowing exactly what we know. Let's keep them sweating." For the next hour, we sketched out a rough plan. Subtle moves, things that would make Jessica and Dave nervous, but wouldn't confirm anything outright. For example, a simple, "I thought I saw you somewhere the other night," thrown casually into conversation, or asking leading questions that would make them think we were tracking their movements. And then we decided on a final confrontation. But this wouldn't be just any showdown. We'd pick a public setting where they couldn't easily slip away, and where they'd have to face what they'd done with everyone watching. Sarah and I made a pact right then and there. We would be partners in this through whatever came next. We shook hands, sealing the deal. As I left Sarah's house, I felt a strange sense of relief. There was still so much hurt, so much betrayal to process, but at least now I wasn't alone. And for the first time, I felt like I had a chance to take back control of my own life. The days that followed were surreal. I went about my routine, trying to act as if nothing had changed, but every interaction with Jessica felt like a silent war. She'd smile at me over breakfast, make small talk about the kids, go on about her plans for the day, and I'd force myself to nod, pretending I didn't know about the double life she was leading. Sarah and I decided to start subtly, testing the waters to see if we could plant seeds of doubt without tipping them off completely. I started with something small, casual comments that were innocent on the surface, but loaded with implications. One night, as Jessica was texting someone, I leaned over and said, "You're pretty popular these days. Who's keeping you up so late?" She froze for a second before forcing a laugh, saying it was a work client. I nodded, looking just interested enough without pressing further. But I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was on alert. Meanwhile, Sarah had started with Dave, dropping hints of her own. Over coffee one morning, she casually mentioned that she'd run into an old friend from college. "Funny thing," she'd told him, "they mentioned seeing you the other night, said you looked cozy with a woman." I told them that couldn't be right, since you're always home. Dave had reportedly stumbled over his words, fumbling out an excuse about a client dinner. Sarah just nodded, giving him that knowing look that sent a chill down his spine. Jessica and Dave started acting strange around us, as we'd hoped. Jessica became more guarded, checking her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. She'd seemed distracted, her gaze darting around the room like she was piecing together a puzzle. But the biggest crack appeared when Jessica came home one evening, her face a mask of forced calm. "Tom," she began, her voice barely hiding a tremor, "Sarah called me today. She seemed, I don't know, a bit off. Have you noticed anything strange about her?" I nearly laughed. They were already unraveling. "Oh, she's probably fine," I replied nonchalantly, keeping my tone casual. "Maybe she's just going through a rough patch." Then I added, almost as an afterthought, "You know, marriages can be tricky. You never know what's really going on behind closed doors." Jessica looked at me, trying to gauge if I was implying something. But I just held her gaze, calm and unreadable. She quickly changed the subject, but I could tell she was rattled. Over the next week, Sarah and I continued with our plan, carefully orchestrating moments that left Jessica and Dave more on edge each day. We'd casually ask each other to meet for coffee or plan to catch up over dinner, making sure Jessica and Dave would know about it. It was working like a charm. The more we met, the more uneasy they became, wondering if we were comparing notes, if we were catching on. Finally, after another innocent coffee with Sarah, Jessica couldn't hold back anymore. That night, she brought it up, acting casual but clearly fishing for information. "You and Sarah seem to be spending a lot of time together lately," she said, trying to sound uninterested. "What's going on?" "Oh, nothing really," I replied, keeping my face as neutral as I could. "We just have a lot to talk about." The look of panic that flickered across her face was priceless. She was losing control, and she knew it. After that conversation, Jessica became almost paranoid. She kept her phone on silent, turned away whenever she was messaging, and would glance up constantly, as if expecting me to confront her at any moment. The more nervous she got, the more I realized how much power I suddenly held over her. It was both gratifying and deeply sad. This woman who I once trusted completely now reduced to secrets and lies. The following weekend, Sarah and I decided to take it up a notch. We'd carefully planned a chance meeting at a local coffee shop. The idea was simple. We'd sit together, close but casual, and wait for Jessica or Dave to happen by. I knew Jessica had a listing nearby that day, so the timing was perfect. Sure enough, about 20 minutes into our meeting, Jessica walked in. She froze when she saw us, her eyes darting between Sarah and me. I pretended not to notice, giving her a moment to collect herself before looking up with a casual smile. "Oh, hey, Jess. Didn't expect to see you here," I said, keeping my tone light. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Tom." "Hi, Sarah." She forced a smile, but it was obvious her mind was racing, trying to piece together what we could possibly be doing there together. Sarah, playing along brilliantly, just smiled and said, "We were just catching up, life and all." Her eyes held that same knowing look we'd practiced, and I could see Jessica's discomfort deepen. "Do you mind if I join?" Jessica asked, her voice strained. Sarah and I exchanged a quick look, and I gave her a slight nod. "Of course." "The more, the merrier," I said, pulling out a chair for her. The three of us sat there, the silence stretching out uncomfortably. I could feel Jessica's tension radiating off her, but she tried to mask it with small talk. She asked Sarah about her job, her kids, anything to steer the conversation away from anything personal. But I couldn't resist, throwing in a casual remark now and then that hinted at something more. You know, Sarah and I have really gotten to know each other well lately, I said, glancing at Jessica just long enough to catch the flicker of fear in her eyes. Sometimes, you just need someone who understands what you're going through. Jessica's face went pale, and she forced a laugh. Well, I guess that's nice. When she finally excused herself to get her coffee, Sarah leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. She's cracking. Did you see her face? I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Yeah, she's on edge. It's only a matter of time. After Jessica left, I couldn't shake the strange emptiness I felt. I'd wanted her to feel the weight of her lies, but watching her crumble wasn't as satisfying as I'd expected. Still, we weren't done yet. Sarah and I had agreed to keep the pressure on until the final confrontation we'd planned. The next day, Sarah texted me, saying that Dave had confronted her too. He'd seen her meeting with me and accused her of airing their dirty laundry to me. She told him she hadn't said a word, but she kept a cryptic smile on her face just long enough to plant that seed of doubt. He'd left the house in a rage, muttering something about needing time to think. Jessica and Dave were now in full panic mode, and that was exactly where we wanted them. With Jessica and Dave unraveling, Sarah and I decided it was time to up the ante. The plan was straightforward but potent. A romantic dinner for Jessica and me. A night that, in theory, would bring us closer, allow us to reconnect, but would actually be the setting for a subtle, relentless confrontation. I set the stage carefully. I made reservations at one of her favorite upscale restaurants and picked up flowers on my way home. When I walked through the door that evening, Jessica was taken aback. I hadn't done anything like this in a while, mostly because I'd been too wrapped up in my own hurt, and I could see her wondering if I was genuinely trying to reconnect or if there was more to it. She smiled a little too widely and played along, slipping into a dress she hadn't worn in months. "Wow, Tom," she said, glancing at herself in the mirror. "You're pulling out all the stops tonight." I shrugged, keeping my expression relaxed. Just thought it'd be nice to spend some time together. You know, just the two of us. We sat down at the restaurant, making small talk over appetizers and a bottle of wine. It was almost surreal, the way she kept stealing glances at me, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. I knew her well enough to recognize that look in her eyes. She was nervous, maybe even a little guilty. As we reached the main course, I decided it was time to nudge her a bit. "So, is there anything you'd like to tell me, Jess?" I asked, my voice low, as if I were casually asking about the weather. Her fork froze midway to her mouth. She put it down slowly, looking at me with carefully masked surprise. "Tell you? About what?" I shrugged again, keeping my tone light. "I don't know. I just feel like maybe there are things we don't talk about. Things we keep hidden." Her face drained of color, and I could see her struggling to come up with something, anything that would deflect my probing. But she wasn't quick enough. Do you have something on your mind?" She stammered, forcing a laugh that came out more like a squeak. I let a slight pause linger, watching her squirm, then leaned back in my chair, giving her an easy smile. "Nothing specific. Just, sometimes I get the feeling that you're not completely here." She looked away, trying to compose herself. "Tom, I don't know what you're implying, but oh, come on, Jess," I interrupted gently, leaning in. "You can be honest with me. I mean, we've been together for so long. Don't you think it's strange that we're not as close as we used to be?" She swallowed, her fingers twisting nervously around her wine glass. "I don't know what you're talking about. Everything's fine, Tom. I've just been busy with work. You know how demanding real estate can be." The lie rolled off her tongue effortlessly, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or the realization that I wasn't buying it. I nodded, feigning understanding. "Right, of course. Work. So, is it the long hours? The late nights?" She went silent, her hand gripping the glass tightly. "Yes, it's just a lot of work, and clients expect so much. You wouldn't understand." The implication that I was clueless about her struggles was almost laughable, but I held back. Letting her think she had the upper hand was part of the plan. "Well, I'm just glad we're able to do this tonight," I said, my tone carefully measured, "to finally connect. It's been a while." Her response was a weak nod, but I could tell she was unsettled, barely holding it together. I could see her mind spinning, trying to guess how much I knew or what I suspected. As we left the restaurant, she walked a few paces ahead of me, her shoulders tense, her smile long gone. I followed her to the car, feeling that thrill of control again. I knew she'd spend the night lying awake, wondering just how much I had figured out. The trap was closing in tighter. That night, Jessica barely spoke once we got home. She went straight to bed, muttering something about being tired, but I could tell her mind was racing. I watched her lying there, staring at the ceiling, her breathing uneven. It was almost satisfying watching her break down, piece by piece. But beneath that satisfaction, a strange ache started to creep in, a reminder of everything we once had and how it had turned to this. I pushed it aside, telling myself that she deserved every ounce of discomfort she felt. Still, as the hours passed and the house lay silent, I couldn't shake the sense of dread. We were heading somewhere irreversible, and the gravity of it hit me in a way I hadn't prepared for. The next morning, Jessica tried to act normal, but there was a nervous energy about her. She kept fidgeting, glancing at me as if expecting me to drop a bombshell. I stayed calm, playing my part, making her wonder if and when I'd confront her. I was starting to see the psychological toll this was taking on her, and it was satisfying. But then she did something that caught me off guard. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed with a text from her. "I'm sorry about last night. I feel like I've been a bit distant. Can we have a date night tomorrow? Just you and me?" I stared at the message, realizing she was trying to regain control, to reassert herself before I could dig deeper. She wanted to steer things back to her version of reality, but I knew better than to fall for it. I texted back a simple, "Of course, Jess. I'd love that," and left it at that. I'd go along with it. Let her believe she was taking the lead again, while Sarah and I planned our next move. Meanwhile, Sarah had her own battles brewing. She'd filled me in that Dave had started acting withdrawn and irritable, snapping at her over the smallest things. He was on edge, and it was clear he was starting to doubt himself, questioning what Sarah might know. It felt like we were in the final stretch with Jessica and Dave both teetering on the edge of collapse. The following night, as planned, I met Jessica for our date. She'd picked a little Italian place on the outskirts of town, somewhere we used to go before everything started to fall apart. The choice was almost painfully ironic, a spot filled with old memories, now tainted by the tension simmering between us. As we sat down, she reached across the table, taking my hand in hers, trying to hold on to whatever semblance of normalcy she thought we still had. "Tom," she began, her voice soft, "I know things haven't been perfect. I felt a little off lately, but I want to work on it. On us." I looked into her eyes, seeing the conflict there, the flickers of guilt and desperation. I forced a gentle smile, squeezing her hand. "I want that too, Jess." But even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. I could see through her performance. Her attempt to salvage things was nothing more than a smokescreen, one last-ditch effort to cover her tracks. She needed me to believe in her story, because the alternative that I might see through her was too terrifying for her to face. We spent the rest of the evening in a strained dance of feigned intimacy, each of us pretending to want something that no longer existed. By the time we left, the weight of it all was bearing down on me. Her betrayal, my bitterness, the looming confrontation, it all felt heavier than ever. The end was near, and as I watched her walk to the car, I felt a strange pang of finality. This life, this marriage, was already gone. We were just playing out the last scenes, and soon there'd be nothing left but ashes. After our strained date, I knew we were nearing the climax of this twisted charade. Jessica's attempts to control the narrative weren't working, and Sarah and I agreed it was time to bring everything to a head. We planned our final confrontation, a reveal they couldn't escape, a way to force them to face the truth publicly. We decided on a setting where Jessica and Dave would be forced to stay put, somewhere neither of them could easily escape from. A friend's party, one with mutual friends, where they'd have no choice but to hear us out in front of a crowd. We kept our plan to ourselves, communicating only through brief texts and quiet phone calls to keep it under wraps. The party was set for that Saturday evening. In the days leading up, Sarah and I coordinated details meticulously. We'd gathered enough evidence to make the truth undeniable. Texts, photos, and timelines, it was all there clear as day. There was no way Jessica or Dave could talk their way out of it. And I could only imagine the panic they'd feel once the puzzle pieces began falling into place in front of everyone. When Saturday night arrived, I could see Jessica's unease as we got ready for the party. She kept glancing at me, her eyes scanning my expression for any hint of what I was thinking. I played along, pretending nothing was amiss, pretending that this was just another night out. She seemed nervous, as if sensing that something was about to happen, but she didn't ask. I almost admired her persistence, her commitment to the lie she'd crafted. We arrived at the party, and I saw Sarah and Dave already mingling with the crowd. Sarah caught my eye, giving me a slight nod, signaling that everything was in place. I could feel my heart pounding, a mix of nerves and anticipation building up as I mentally rehearsed what I was about to do. After a while, Sarah and I exchanged a look. This was it. "Hey, everyone," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just wanted to say a few words." People turned to look at me, their conversations dropping off, and Jessica shot me a confused look. "Jessica, I think it's time we let everyone in on a little secret," I said, my voice calm, but laced with a quiet intensity. I watched her face, the confusion slowly morphing into something else, panic. Her hand went to her mouth as if to stop herself from saying anything, her eyes widening as realization dawned. Beside her, Dave looked equally alarmed. Sarah stepped forward, standing beside me, her face set with the same resolve. The room fell silent, all eyes now on the four of us. "We've been keeping something to ourselves for a while now," I continued, holding Jessica's gaze. "Sarah and I found out that there's been more going on between our spouses than just friendship." My voice was low, controlled, but I could feel the weight of my words filling the room. Jessica's face went pale. Dave's mouth opened, but no words came out. Sarah handed me a stack of printed messages, and I held them up for everyone to see. "These are messages between Jessica and Dave," I said, my tone unyielding. "Conversations they thought would stay private, plans they thought we'd never uncover." A murmur went through the crowd, people whispering, eyes darting between Jessica and Dave. I watched Jessica's face as her world crumbled, the lies she'd spun falling apart in front of our friends, in front of people who'd respected her, trusted her. She tried to speak, her voice a barely audible whisper. "Tom, please," but I wasn't done. I looked at Dave, my voice turning cold. "Dave, you've been betraying your wife, your family. You two thought you could keep this hidden, but the truth always finds a way out." Sarah stepped forward, her voice breaking as she addressed Dave directly. "I trusted you. We built a life together, and you destroyed it." Jessica and Dave stood there, their faces frozen in shock and shame. The room felt electric with tension, and I could see our friends looking at them with a mixture of pity and disgust. They were exposed, stripped of their pretenses, and for once, they had nothing to hide behind. The silence stretched on as people began to understand the full weight of what had happened. Jessica's eyes were full of tears, her hands shaking, but I felt nothing but a hollow satisfaction. It was over. We'd laid it all bare, and there was no going back. Once the weight of our revelation settled over the room, the silence was thick and uncomfortable. I could see some of our friends whispering among themselves, exchanging looks of disbelief and sympathy. Jessica and Dave, however, looked utterly defeated, like they'd been stripped down to the core, left with nothing but the remnants of their dignity clinging to them. Jessica's face was wet with tears she hadn't even tried to hide, but it didn't affect me. I felt empty. There was no satisfaction, no real sense of victory. Just an overwhelming hollowness, a grim reminder of everything I'd just lost. After a few minutes of heavy silence, Sarah spoke up, her voice calm but sharp. "Jessica, Dave, I think you owe us and everyone here an explanation." She folded her arms, her face set in a mask of controlled anger. I could tell she was barely holding it together, but she wouldn't let them see her break. Jessica opened her mouth, searching for something, anything, to say, but the words wouldn't come. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for support that wasn't there, desperately hoping for some kind of escape. Finally, she whispered, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It just happened. I nearly laughed. It just happened. The sheer audacity of it. You mean you didn't mean for us to find out? I corrected her, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. Because let's be honest, Jess, you knew exactly what you were doing every time you snuck around with him. Dave, for his part, looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. He muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like an apology, but it was weak, hollow, and insincere. He didn't seem sorry. He seemed embarrassed, caught red-handed, not remorseful. Is that it? Sarah pressed, her voice trembling. You're sorry because we caught you? You destroyed our lives, lied to us day after day, and that's all you have to say? Jessica finally looked up, and there was a flash of defiance in her eyes, mingled with desperation. You don't understand. Tom, you were always so busy. Always working, always focused on your business. I felt neglected, lonely. I needed someone, and Dave was there. The words stung, but they also made me furious. So this is my fault now? Because I worked to give you everything you ever wanted? She tried to hold her ground, but the accusation faltered as the reality of the situation sank in. I didn't mean it like that. I made a mistake, okay? We both did. Sarah's laughter cut through the tension, sharp and bitter. A mistake? That's what you're calling it? A mistake you made over and over again? Right under our noses? Her voice was raw, her composure cracking, and for the first time, I saw tears forming in her eyes. Jessica and Dave had nothing left to say. They stood there, heads lowered, avoiding our gazes as the weight of their betrayal settled around them. Finally, Sarah and I looked at each other, the unspoken agreement clear. This was over. We didn't need to hear any more lies, didn't need to dissect the details. I turned back to Jessica, my voice quiet but final. We're done. You've taken everything that mattered in this marriage and destroyed it. I hope it was worth it. With that, I turned and walked toward the door, Sarah close behind me. We left them there, standing amidst the whispers and judgment of friends who now saw them for what they were. Outside, Sarah let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping as the reality of everything crashed down on her. I put a hand on her shoulder, both of us feeling the weight of our losses, but also a strange, bitter relief. We were free from lies, free from the people who'd betrayed us, free to rebuild our lives without them. As we walked away from the party, I felt a glimmer of something else, a hope, maybe that someday life could be good again. But for now, all I knew was that we had each other to lean on, and that was enough. In the days that followed the confrontation, a strange quiet settled over my life. For years, I'd been running on autopilot, caught up in the grind of work, of marriage, of fatherhood. Now, it was like I'd woken up in a completely foreign landscape, one where everything I thought I knew had crumbled to dust. Jessica moved out, taking only a few bags with her, leaving the house empty and hollow. She didn't even say goodbye to the kids, a fact that shocked me more than I thought possible. It was as if her guilt, her shame, prevented her from facing them. Or maybe it was just easier for her to leave, to avoid facing the damage she'd caused. Sarah and I kept in touch, supporting each other as best we could. She was struggling with her own pain, and I could hear it in her voice whenever we talked. We were both processing the betrayal, trying to make sense of the surreal, nightmarish situation we'd been thrust into. Our conversations were an odd blend of rage, grief, and, occasionally, dark humor. There were even moments of laughter, where we shared the absurdities of our spouses' excuses and lies, moments that felt like tiny respites in the middle of a storm. One evening, a few days after the party, Sarah called me. "I don't know how you're holding up, Tom," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I feel like I'm barely keeping it together." "Honestly, I'm not sure I am either," I replied. "Some days, it feels like I'm watching someone else's life fall apart. Like this can't really be happening." She sighed. "I know. It's like everything we worked for, everything we built, it's all just gone." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us absorbing the finality of it. The silence felt heavy, weighted with everything we couldn't put into words. And then, unexpectedly, Sarah spoke up again. Do you ever wonder what they're thinking? If they even care about what they did? The question hung in the air, and I realized I hadn't given it much thought. I hadn't allowed myself to wonder about Jessica's feelings because it hurt too much to imagine that she might still feel justified, that she might see herself as the victim. Honestly, Sarah, I don't know. I think they're just ashamed. Maybe they're too scared to face the mess they created. Or maybe they just don't care enough. I really don't know. She let out a small, bitter laugh. Isn't it funny how we spent all those years thinking we knew them? And now, it's like they're strangers. That struck a chord. Jessica felt like a stranger now, someone I couldn't even recognize. I used to think we had a solid foundation, that we were partners in everything, that we were on the same side. But now I knew better. She'd been someone else all along, someone capable of lying to me, betraying me, and walking away without a backward glance. We talked a bit longer, and by the time we hung up, I felt a little lighter. Knowing I wasn't alone in this, that someone else truly understood what I was going through, was strangely comforting. It didn't make the pain go away, but it made it a little more bearable. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the routine of parenting, trying to create some normalcy for the kids. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they sensed the shift, the absence of their mother. I did my best to reassure them, to keep things steady, even though inside, I was barely holding myself together. Life had taken a dark, painful turn, but I knew that I had to keep moving forward. I had no choice. The betrayal was still raw, the wounds still fresh, but I was determined to keep going, to rebuild my life piece by piece. A week after Jessica left, reality set in even harder. The kids started asking about her, innocent questions that cut me to the bone. "Where's Mommy?" my youngest asked one morning over breakfast. She had that little furrowed brow, the one she gets when she's confused. I could see her trying to process the strange absence of her mom from the house, trying to understand why things had suddenly changed. "Mommy needed some time away," I said slowly, hating myself for the vague answer, but knowing it was all I could offer. "But she loves you both very much, and she'll see you soon." It was the best I could manage without putting my own bitterness and resentment into words they wouldn't understand. They nodded, their young minds accepting what they couldn't fully comprehend, and went back to their cereal. But I could see the lingering questions in their eyes, ones I knew would only grow more complicated as time went on. That evening, I finally broke down and called Jessica. I'd been avoiding it, not wanting to hear her voice, not wanting to confront the person she'd become. But I had to for the kids. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious, almost wary. "Tom." "Jessica," I said, struggling to keep my tone even. "We need to talk about the kids. They're asking about you." She let out a sigh. "I know, I wasn't ready to face them yet. I need some time to process everything." I nearly laughed. Process everything? She was the one who detonated our lives. And now she was too overwhelmed to deal with the fallout? "They're your kids, Jessica. You can't just disappear on them because things got complicated." There was a pause, and I could hear her shifting, maybe pacing on the other end. "I didn't mean for it to be like this, Tom. I never wanted to hurt them." "Well, you did," I replied sharply. "So you need to figure out how to fix it. They need to know they still have a mother." She went quiet again, and for a moment, I thought she might hang up. But then, in a small, hesitant voice, she said, "Can I see them tomorrow? Maybe I can pick them up from school?" I hesitated, but I knew I couldn't deny her that, no matter how much anger was swirling inside me. "Fine, but you need to be clear with them. They deserve that." The next day, Jessica picked the kids up as planned. She took them to a nearby park, and I watched from a distance as they played, trying to act normal in the face of her sudden reappearance. She smiled and laughed, doing her best to seem like the mom they'd always known, but I could see through it. There was a forced quality to her movements, a nervous energy that betrayed the cracks she was trying to hide. When they came home that evening, the kids were quieter than usual, as if they sensed something off, even if they couldn't put it into words. They asked fewer questions, their faces more serious, like they were processing the changes in their own way. And so began the new, messy chapter of co-parenting with Jessica. We established a schedule that allowed her to spend time with the kids without her stepping too deeply back into my life. She'd pick them up from school a few times a week, take them out, and bring them back in the evening. The arrangement was strained, uncomfortable, but it was better than nothing. In the midst of it all, Sarah and I continued to lean on each other, sharing updates and stories from the battlefield of co-parenting with our ex-spouses. She was struggling with her own set of challenges, navigating the broken pieces of her life, and trying to hold things together for her kids. One night, over the phone, Sarah sighed, a mixture of exhaustion and resignation in her voice. "It feels like I'm living two lives now. One for my kids, trying to pretend like things are okay, and one for myself, where nothing is okay." "I get that," I said quietly. "I'm trying to keep it together for them, too." But inside, everything's still a mess. We fell into a long silence, each of us lost in our own pain, but somehow comforted by the fact that we weren't alone in it. The betrayal still burned, the hurt still fresh, but with each passing day, it felt just a little bit more manageable. There was still so much ahead of us, so much to figure out. But as long as we had each other's support, I felt that maybe, just maybe, we'd get through this chaos in one piece. In the following weeks, a strange rhythm emerged. Jessica and I kept our contact brief and businesslike, exchanging necessary information about the kids and keeping any personal conversations to a minimum. Each interaction was a reminder of what we'd lost, but I felt a bit stronger with each passing day. The kids, though still adjusting, seemed to adapt as well, their resilience shining through in ways that left me both proud and heartbroken. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, I called Sarah. Talking to her had become a regular part of my routine, a safe space where I could let down my guard and speak honestly. She understood the highs and lows of my new reality like no one else could. "Hey, Tom," she answered, her voice warm and familiar. "Rough day." "Yeah," I sighed. "Some days are easier, but others it just hits me out of nowhere. It's like I think I'm getting over it, and then bam, I'm right back there, feeling all of it again." "I get it," she said softly. "Grief isn't a straight line. Some days it feels like a roller coaster, and other days it's just a quiet, dull ache." We sat in silence for a moment, each of us processing. Then, almost as an afterthought, she suggested, "Maybe we could get the kids together sometime. I think they'd enjoy it, and it'd be nice too. I don't know, feel like we're moving forward, even in small ways." The idea of bringing our kids together had crossed my mind before, but I hadn't acted on it. Maybe I'd been afraid that doing so would make this new life feel too real. But now, in the midst of all the confusion and pain, it felt like a small step toward healing, a chance to create a memory that wasn't tied to betrayal or loss. "I think that sounds good," I replied, feeling a faint sense of relief. They deserve to have something normal, even if things are different now. The following Saturday, Sarah and I met at a local park with the kids. The air was crisp, filled with the faint smell of fallen leaves, and the sun cast a warm glow over everything. Our kids, who'd met each other only a few times in passing before, took to each other immediately. They played tag, laughed on the swings, and bonded over shared jokes and games, unaware of the broken pieces that lay behind their parents' polite smiles. Watching them, I felt a pang of nostalgia for what could have been, a life where everything was as simple as a day at the park, where Jessica and I were the parents laughing on the sidelines, united in our love for our children. But as I looked over at Sarah, I felt a different sense of peace. She wasn't Jessica, but she was someone who understood, someone who was navigating the same shattered world I was. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and I shared small smiles and exchanged glances that needed no words. We were both here, surviving, piecing together a new normal from the ruins of our old lives. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Later, when the kids were exhausted and we were gathering our things, Sarah turned to me, her expression softer than usual. "Thank you, Tom. I didn't think I'd be able to find even a small bit of peace in all this. But today was nice." I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope that had been absent for far too long. "Yeah, it was. Maybe there's a way forward after all." We said our goodbyes, but as I walked back to the car, I felt different. The pain was still there, the memories still raw, but for the first time, they felt a little less sharp, a little less consuming. It was a small step, just a quiet afternoon at the park, but it felt like a beginning of something new. Maybe not what I'd planned for, maybe not what I'd wanted, but something real and hopeful nonetheless. After that day at the park, Sarah and I began to see each other more often. Not in a romantic sense, but as two people navigating the aftermath of betrayal and finding some comfort in shared understanding. Our friendship became a kind of therapy, a way to let out the emotions we couldn't share with others. We'd meet for coffee or bring the kids to the same park, letting them play while we talked about the daily struggles, the moments of doubt, and the lingering wounds left by Jessica and Dave. One evening, after a particularly challenging day with the kids, I texted Sarah to see if she was up for a coffee. We ended up meeting at a quiet little cafe, tucked away from the noise of our everyday lives. The place was nearly empty, and the soft music and dim lighting gave it an atmosphere that felt safe, like a place where we could let down our guard. "Thanks for meeting me," I said as we settled into a corner booth. "I just needed a break. Today was one of those days." She nodded, understanding without asking. "Trust me, I get it. Some days, it's like I'm barely holding on, just trying to keep everything together for the kids." We sipped our coffees, the silence comfortable, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Then, Sarah spoke, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I used to think I knew everything about him. Dave, now I realized there was a whole side of him I never saw, never even imagined existed. I feel the same way about Jessica," I replied, the bitterness slipping through. "It's like she's a stranger now, someone I never really knew at all." Sarah looked at me, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder if it was something we did? Something we missed?" The question stung because I'd asked myself the same thing countless times. I'd spent sleepless nights replaying moments, conversations, looking for signs, for mistakes I might have made. "Yeah, I wonder, but I don't think it was us, Sarah. I think they were just willing to betray us for whatever reason made sense to them." She nodded, a sadness clouding her expression. "You're probably right. It's just hard to let go of the idea that maybe I could have prevented it." The vulnerability in her voice hit me hard, and I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. It was a simple gesture, a quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone in this. She looked down at our hands, then back up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something else, something unspoken. "Thank you, Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I could get through this without you." Her words touched something deep inside me. This connection, this raw honesty we shared, it was unlike anything I'd experienced before. There was no pretense, no hiding. Just two people who'd been broken and were trying, in their own clumsy way, to piece themselves back together. As we sat there, I felt a warmth that was both comforting and unfamiliar. It wasn't romance, not exactly. It was a kind of closeness born from shared pain, a trust that had formed in the wake of our shattered lives. Eventually, we left the cafe, but the feeling lingered. For the first time in a long time, I felt something that went beyond the grief, beyond the anger. I felt hope, not a grand, sweeping hope for a perfect future, but a small, quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, life could be good again. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Sarah, about the friendship we'd built and the moments we'd shared. I realized that, in the midst of all the heartache, I'd found someone who understood me in a way no one else could. And that, I knew, was something worth holding on to. It was still a long road ahead, but now I had a companion on the journey. Someone who'd walk beside me, who'd help me pick up the pieces. And for the first time, I felt like I might actually make it through. Over the next few weeks, my connection with Sarah deepened in ways I hadn't expected. What began as a survival strategy, two broken people finding solace in each other, was turning into something more nuanced, something fragile yet grounding. We talk almost every day, sometimes about the raw moments of betrayal, sometimes just about simple things, books, movies, even our dreams for the future. It was strange to imagine a future again, but Sarah made it feel possible. Then one afternoon, Jessica called. She hadn't reached out much since leaving. sticking to a routine of brief texts about the kids and visitation times. But today, there was a different tone in her voice, a hint of something more purposeful. "Tom, I think we need to talk," she said. "In person. About everything." There was a pause, a moment where I weighed my options. I didn't owe her this conversation, not after what she'd done, but part of me wanted closure. I wanted to finally put to rest all the questions, all the unresolved emotions that still hung over us like a dark cloud. "All right," I replied. "When?" We agreed to meet at a cafe near her new place the next day. That night, I felt the anxiety creeping in, memories flooding back, along with a mix of anger, sadness, and strangely, a flicker of nervous anticipation. I hadn't seen her alone since the truth came out, and I wasn't sure what to expect. When I arrived, she was already seated, looking out the window with an expression that was almost haunted. She looked up as I approached, forcing a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, her voice hesitant. I nodded, sitting across from her. "What did you want to talk about?" She took a deep breath, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her coffee cup. I know I hurt you, Tom, more than I can probably ever understand. And I know that an apology doesn't fix anything, but I wanted you to hear it from me." There was something in her voice that felt genuine, a flicker of remorse that seemed deeper than before. But still, I couldn't shake the anger, the betrayal that lingered like a scar across my heart. "Why, Jessica?" I asked, my voice softer than I'd intended. Why all the lies?" She looked down, a shadow crossing her face. "I don't have a good answer, Tom. I was selfish. I felt neglected, like I was fading into the background of your life and Dave was there. It doesn't excuse anything. I know that. But I was so caught up in my own needs, my own loneliness, that I didn't care about the damage I was doing." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a strange mix of pity and bitterness. Part of me wanted to understand, to make sense of the twisted logic that had led her down this path. But another part of me felt numb, as if her explanation was just noise, a hollow excuse that couldn't reach the parts of me she'd broken. "What did you think was going to happen?" I asked. "Did you think I'd never find out? That our family could just go on like nothing happened?" She shook her head, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I was delusional, Tom. I know that now. I thought I could have both lives, that I could keep the family and also feel something different, something that was missing. It was selfish and wrong, and I see that now." There was a long silence, each of us lost in the mess of our emotions. Finally, she looked up, her gaze softer. "I know things can't go back to the way they were, but for the kids' sake, I want us to be able to talk, to co-parent without this resentment hanging over us." Her words were sensible, logical, but they stung. Part of me wanted to tell her that I couldn't forgive her, that the wound she'd left was still too raw. But another part of me knew that, for the kids, I had to try. I had to find some semblance of peace, not for her, but for myself. "Jessica, I'll do what's best for the kids," I said, my voice steady. "But don't expect me to just forget. What you did, it's not something I can erase." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I understand." After that, we spoke briefly about logistics, arranging schedules, dividing responsibilities. It was a clinical conversation, one that felt strangely detached, as if we were business partners rather than two people who had once shared a life, a family, a love. When we parted, I felt a strange sense of relief. I'd gotten the closure I needed, not because she'd offered any magical words of redemption, but because I'd faced her, heard her out, and realized that I didn't need her answers to move forward. Later that night, I called Sarah. I told her about the conversation, sharing every painful detail, and she listened, offering understanding without judgment. Her words were like a balm, soothing the rawness left behind from my meeting with Jessica. "You did the right thing, Tom," she said gently. "It takes strength to confront something like that. And now, you can really start letting go." For the first time, I felt a glimmer of truth in her words. It was time to let go, not just of Jessica, but of the anger, the betrayal, the endless questions. It was time to focus on what mattered, my kids, my healing, and maybe, just maybe, the quiet, tentative connection I'd found with Sarah. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step. And for now, that was enough. After my conversation with Jessica, something shifted inside me. I felt lighter, as if I'd finally put down a weight I'd been carrying for too long. There was still pain, still moments of anger, but now they felt more like echoes, faint remnants of a storm that had finally passed. I could see the road ahead a bit more clearly, and for the first time, I felt ready to take those steps forward. Sarah and I continued our friendship, leaning on each other as we both found our way through this new chapter. Our kids had started looking forward to their time together, and our regular meetups at the park turned into something like a ritual. The kids brought laughter back into my life, their resilience a reminder that life could go on, that joy could still be found, even after heartbreak. One evening, Sarah invited me over for dinner. Nothing fancy, just a casual meal while the kids played in the backyard. But as I walked into her home, I realized how much of a comfort it had become. Her space felt familiar, welcoming, a refuge from the chaos outside. And Sarah herself was no longer just an ally in betrayal. She'd become a friend I trusted deeply, someone who understood my pain and my hopes for the future in ways no one else could. Dinner was relaxed, and we fell into easy conversation. We talked about our kids, the latest things they were into, and traded stories about the strange, funny moments that came with being single parents. After the kids went to bed, we lingered at the table, our conversation becoming quieter, more reflective. "I don't think I ever told you, Tom," Sarah began, her voice soft. "But you've been a lifeline for me. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Her words hung in the air, and I could feel a warmth spreading in my chest, a sense of gratitude mixed with something deeper, something I hadn't fully allowed myself to acknowledge until that moment. "Sarah," I replied, my voice catching a little, "you've been that for me too. I can't even imagine getting through this without you. I'd be lost." She looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Do you ever wonder if maybe this was all meant to happen? That we were meant to meet like this? Even if it took something so painful?" I hadn't thought of it that way, but as she spoke, the idea didn't feel so far-fetched. Our connection, our friendship, it felt like something more than coincidence, like something we both needed to heal, to find ourselves again. I could see the same thought mirrored in her eyes. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of possibility, of something new, something untainted by the past. I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine, just as I had in the cafe weeks before. This time, though, the gesture felt different. There was a warmth, an unspoken understanding, a feeling of something quietly building between us. "Maybe it was meant to be," I said softly. "Maybe we were both meant to find each other here, to help each other through this." We sat there in silence, letting the moment settle, neither of us needing to say anything more. There was no rush, no urgency to define what was happening. We'd both been through enough to know that life doesn't always go as planned, that love and friendship can take on different forms, and that sometimes the best things come when you least expect them. As I left her house that night, I felt a quiet, steady hope blooming inside me. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was gentle, patient, something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. I didn't know what the future held for Sarah and me, but I knew that I was open to whatever path lay ahead. For the first time since Jessica's betrayal, I felt free. Free to move on, free to embrace this new life, and maybe, just maybe, free to open my heart again. The weeks after that night at Sarah's were marked by a sense of quiet anticipation. Our friendship deepened, and something unspoken grew between us, delicate and tentative, like the first green shoots pushing through after a long winter. We didn't rush into anything, and there was no need to define what we were. Our shared pain had forged a unique bond, one that didn't need labels to feel real. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah and I decided to take the kids on a hike. It was one of those crisp autumn days, with the trees ablaze in shades of red, orange, and gold. We found a quiet trail, one that wound through a forest dense with fallen leaves, and set off together, letting the kids run ahead and chase each other through the woods. Walking beside Sarah, surrounded by the vibrant beauty of nature, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. We talked about everything and nothing, sometimes falling into comfortable silences where words weren't necessary. I realized then that it wasn't just the presence of someone else that brought me comfort. It was Sarah herself. Her kindness, her quiet strength, the way she could see me at my most vulnerable and make me feel safe. At one point, we paused to watch the kids play on a fallen log, balancing and laughing as they tried not to fall. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, both of us smiling at the sight. There was something magical about watching them together, our two families merging in this simple, joyful way. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the trees, we made our way back to the car. The kids fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from their day of adventure, and Sarah and I sat quietly in the front, the hum of the road the only sound between us. When we reached her house, I helped carry her youngest inside, placing him gently in his bed while she tucked in her daughter. We met back in the living room, standing there in the soft light, both of us reluctant to say goodbye just yet. "Thank you, Tom," she said, her voice low. "Today was exactly what I needed. I think it's what the kids needed too." I nodded, feeling that same warmth from before, that quiet connection that felt deeper than anything I'd experienced in a long time. "Me too." It felt like family. Her eyes softened, and I could see a hint of emotion there, something raw and beautiful. "It did, didn't it?" She reached out, brushing a leaf from my shoulder, her fingers lingering for just a moment. Without thinking, I reached for her hand, holding it gently, feeling the warmth of her skin. We stood there, just breathing, the silence between us charged with something unspoken. I could feel my heart beating a little faster, and in that moment, I knew that this was real. Whatever it was, whatever it could become, it was real. "Sarah," I murmured barely above a whisper. "I know we're both healing, and I don't want to rush anything. But I feel something here, something I didn't expect to feel again." Her eyes met mine, and I could see the same emotions reflected back at me. "I feel it too, Tom. I didn't think I'd be able to trust again, to feel this way about someone. But with you it feels right." We didn't kiss, didn't rush into anything more. Instead, we stood there, holding each other's hands, letting the warmth and quiet promise of something new settle between us. There was no need to rush. We'd both been through enough to know that love doesn't have to be hurried. Sometimes, it's the quiet, steady moments that mean the most. That night, as I drove home, I felt a profound sense of peace. My heart, which had been shattered and bruised, was slowly mending, finding hope again in the most unexpected places. And with Sarah, I knew I'd found more than a friend. I'd found a partner, someone who understood my pain and my dreams, someone who was willing to walk with me, step by step, into whatever the future might hold. I wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. Not alone, but with Sarah by my side, and with the possibility of a new kind of family, a family built on trust, understanding, and a love that was patient, steady, and real. As the days turned into weeks, my life began to feel like a strange blend of the familiar and the new. Jessica was still in the background, her role as a co-parent keeping her presence steady but distant. We'd figured out a rhythm, establishing boundaries that allowed us to interact civilly for the kids' sake. I'd let go of the anger, mostly, and now it felt like Jessica and I were more like distant acquaintances, bound by our children, but otherwise leading separate lives. But the true change, the part that felt like a quiet revolution in my life, was Sarah. It was as if our lives were gradually intertwining, like roots from two trees growing closer and closer, naturally and steadily. We kept things simple and slow, allowing our connection to grow at its own pace, letting the comfort between us deepen without pressure. We were still just friends in the eyes of others, including our kids, but there were glances and small touches, those subtle moments that held so much unspoken meaning between us. Then came the holidays, the first since everything had changed. It was my year to have the kids for Thanksgiving, and Sarah had her too, so we decided to spend it together. It felt right, like a quiet acknowledgement of the new life we were building, even if it was still unspoken. Sarah and her kids came over that Thursday morning, bringing a homemade pumpkin pie and a basket of fresh rolls. I'd done my best to prepare a traditional meal, turkey, stuffing, all the trimmings, and together, we managed to pull off a spread that was both comforting and festive. As we sat around the table, watching the kids laugh and trade stories, I felt a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just the happiness of a holiday. It was the sense of belonging, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I'd found a new family in the most unexpected way. After the meal, Sarah and I sat on the couch, sipping coffee as we watched the kids playing board games on the floor. The house was filled with the sounds of their laughter, the occasional groan of defeat as one of them lost a game. And it struck me how right it all felt. How this scene, this little piece of life, was so different from anything I'd planned, yet exactly what I needed. "Thank you, Tom," Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. This is more than I could have ever hoped for. I thought this time of year would feel empty, but with you it feels whole." I turned to her, taking her hand in mine, my thumb brushing gently over her fingers. "I feel the same way, Sarah. I never thought I'd feel this kind of happiness again, especially after everything. But with you, it feels real, like something I can trust." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat there, wrapped in the quiet of the moment, letting the warmth of our connection settle around us. We didn't need big declarations or grand gestures. This simple moment was enough. It was a silent promise, a shared understanding that we were both ready for something new, something real. As the evening wound down and Sarah prepared to leave, we lingered by the door, neither of us wanting to say goodbye just yet. Finally, I pulled her into a hug, and for the first time, I let myself fully embrace her, holding her close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against mine. When we finally pulled away, she looked up at me, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something I knew was mirrored in my own gaze. "Happy Thanksgiving, Tom," she whispered, her voice full of quiet joy. "Happy Thanksgiving, Sarah," I replied, my heart full. That night, after she and the kids left, I put my own children to bed, tucking them in and watching them drift off to sleep with peaceful smiles on their faces. And as I closed their doors, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a sense of home, of hope, of a future that for the first time in a long time felt bright. With Sarah, I'd found something I hadn't dared to hope for, a new beginning. And as I went to bed that night, I knew that whatever the future held, I was ready to embrace it, step by step, with her by my side. Thanksgiving marked a quiet shift, an unspoken acknowledgement that Sarah and I were moving towards something deeper. But as our connection grew, I knew that we'd need to start including the kids more consciously. They were getting closer, spending time together almost like siblings. And it only seemed fair to prepare them for the possibility that Sarah and I were becoming more than just friends. One evening, as I was tucking my daughter in, she looked up at me, her young eyes wide with curiosity. "Daddy," she asked, "why do we spend so much time with Miss Sarah and her kids?" The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated, trying to find the right words. I didn't want to overcomplicate things for her, but I also wanted to be honest, to lay a foundation of openness. "Well," I began slowly, sitting on the edge of her bed, "Miss Sarah and I have been helping each other through some tough times. We're good friends, and I think we make each other happy. And I think we make a pretty good team." She seemed to consider this, her small face thoughtful. "Does that mean she's like family?" I felt a warmth in my chest at her question. "Maybe," I said softly. "She and her kids have become very special to us, haven't they?" She nodded, satisfied with my answer, and snuggled deeper into her blankets. "I like that," she murmured, her eyes growing heavy with sleep. "I like having them around." As I turned off the light and closed her door, I felt a sense of relief. Maybe this transition would be easier than I'd thought. Kids, after all, had a remarkable way of accepting things as they were, without the baggage of expectation or hurt. The next weekend, Sarah and I decided it was time to talk with her kids as well. We gathered everyone in the living room, and as the kids settled in with their snacks and drinks, Sarah and I exchanged a glance, each of us taking a deep breath. Kids, Sarah started, her voice gentle but steady, Mr. Tom, and I wanted to talk to you about something. You know how we've been spending a lot of time together, right? They all nodded, their attention focused on her, their young faces a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Well, she continued, we wanted to let you know that we're thinking of becoming closer friends. Almost like one big team. Does that make sense? There was a moment of silence as they absorbed her words. Then one of her kids piped up, grinning, so, does that mean more movie nights? And hiking trips? Sarah and I laughed, the tension easing. Yes, exactly, I said. We'll keep doing the things we love together. And if we all feel comfortable with it, we might even become more like one big family. The kids seemed thrilled, talking excitedly about all the things we could do together. Their acceptance was pure, unburdened by the complexities that Sarah and I had faced. Seeing their joy, I felt a quiet reassurance, a sense that this path we were on was the right one. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Sarah and I sat on her back porch, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. There was a sense of calm between us, an ease that came from knowing our kids were not only okay with this transition, but excited about it. I was so nervous about that conversation, Sarah admitted, her hand in mine, her fingers warm and steady. But they made it so easy. I smiled, pulling her closer. I know. I think maybe we worry more than we need to. Maybe they knew all along that we were headed here. She looked up at me, her eyes shining with quiet happiness. I think you're right, Tom. And I think I'm ready for this. All of it. With you. In that moment, everything felt perfect. The journey that had started in pain and betrayal was now transforming into something beautiful. Something built on trust, on mutual respect, and on the hope of a shared future. As I held her hand under the starlit sky, I felt the last of my fears melt away. We were building a new family, not the one we'd originally envisioned, but one that felt stronger, more genuine, and maybe even more full of love than we'd dared to hope for. It was a new beginning, one filled with a promise of something real and lasting. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly, deeply happy. With the holidays behind us and the new year approaching, Sarah and I found ourselves looking ahead, no longer just coping day to day, but actually making plans. The decision to blend our lives and families was something we both held with quiet reverence. We knew the road wouldn't always be smooth, that there would be hurdles as we navigated this new chapter, but we were ready to face them together. On New Year's Eve, we planned a quiet celebration with all the kids at my house. We decorated the living room with fairy lights, set up a midnight snack table with treats, and played music as the kids danced and laughed, each one basking in the newfound warmth of our blended family. They wore silly hats, threw confetti, and made resolutions they'd probably forget by morning. It was chaotic and loud and absolutely perfect. As the countdown to midnight began, Sarah and I gathered with the kids in a circle, counting down each second with growing excitement. When the clock struck midnight, the room erupted in cheers and hugs, our laughter and joy filling every corner of the house. In that moment, Sarah turned to me, her eyes shining. She took my hand, and with the kids chattering around us, I felt the rest of the world fall away. There was just us, our families merging, our lives intertwining in a way that felt both tender and profound. Tom, she said softly, leaning in close, this past year it was the hardest one of my life. But meeting you, going through all of this together, it made everything worth it. I can't imagine going into this new year without you by my side. I squeezed her hand, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I feel the same way, Sarah. I never thought I'd get another chance at love, let alone find a friend, a partner like you. I think this is the life we were meant to find. Without thinking, I leaned in and kissed her, the noise around us fading as our lips met, sealing our commitment to this new beginning. The kiss was gentle, a quiet promise, a moment that felt both surreal and completely right. When we pulled back, the kids had noticed and were giggling, some pretending to gag in that typical kid way, while others simply looked up at us with smiles. There was no embarrassment, just pure happiness shared among all of us. as if they sensed that this was the beginning of something beautiful. As the night went on, Sarah and I snuck little moments alone, basking in the newfound comfort of knowing we were officially building a life together. The kids eventually fell asleep, scattered around the living room in sleeping bags and blankets, their faces peaceful, untroubled by the trials of the past. Sarah and I stayed up a little longer, sitting on the couch in the quiet glow of the lights, watching over our sleeping kids, our new family. It felt like a miracle in its own way, a second chance, not just for love, but for a life that was full, meaningful, and deeply rooted in trust. When the sun began to rise on the first day of the new year, I realized that I was genuinely happy, something I hadn't thought possible after everything that had happened. I looked at Sarah beside me, at our kids who'd brought us together, and I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. This was our new life, our new family, built from the ashes of heartbreak and strengthened by a love that was quiet, steady, and unwavering. And as the first light of the new year crept into the room, I held Sarah's hand, ready to face the future, filled with hope for whatever lay ahead.